The city's skyline glittered with false promises, towers of glass and steel reflecting the ambitions of corporations that fed on the dreams of those who had nothing. Beneath their polished facades, boardrooms whispered with schemes, and contracts were written in ink that bled red into the lives of ordinary people. Among those lives was Claire Duval's, a woman who had spent years believing in loyalty, honesty, and hard work, only to learn that in the world of the powerful, those values were considered weaknesses. Claire had once been a rising star within a finance firm that dressed itself as a benevolent investor but operated as a predator. The company, Mercadia Holdings, prided itself on empowering growth, but behind the marketing slogans was a machine designed to strip struggling businesses of their assets, push them into bankruptcy, and leave entire families ruined. Claire had begun her career there fresh from university, wide-eyed and ambitious, believing she could make a difference. She stayed late, worked through weekends, and delivered results that far exceeded expectations. And for years, she had convinced herself that she was helping people. The illusion broke the day she stumbled upon files that weren't meant for her eyes. They were buried within a server directory, mislabeled invoices that detailed a network of shell companies. Funds were shuffled back and forth to create the illusion of losses, while Mercadia's executives pocketed millions. Small businesses, cafes, mom-and-pop stores, family farms, were systematically targeted. Loans were extended with suffocating terms, then recalled at moments designed to guarantee default. Claire had read line after line, realizing with a sick twist in her gut that these weren't accidents or market forces. They were orchestrated tragedies, deliberately crafted by the people she reported to. At first, Claire tried to raise concerns quietly. She spoke to a manager she trusted, only to be met with a smile that was both pitying and threatening. "Don't get yourself in trouble," he had said, patting her on the arm before closing the door behind her. Within a week, she found herself reassigned to meaningless projects. Her access to sensitive files was revoked. Soon after, rumors circulated about her instability and erratic behavior. Claire saw it for what it was, the corporation's way of discrediting her before she could become a problem. The breaking point came when her father's modest printing shop, her family's livelihood, was suddenly hit with a recall notice on a loan he had never agreed to. Mercadia's name was on the paperwork. She understood then that they weren't just protecting their empire. They were willing to crush anyone who stood in their way, even her family. The anger that burned in Claire's chest that night became the fuel for her vengeance. She stopped thinking of herself as a powerless employee. Instead, she began gathering every scrap of information she had managed to copy before her access was revoked. Numbers, spreadsheets, falsified invoices, each was a weapon waiting to be sharpened. She knew she couldn't fight them head-on. Their lawyers would bury her, their PR machine would destroy her credibility. So she learned to fight on their terms. For months, Claire lived a double life. By day, she played the role of the disgraced former analyst, unemployed and licking her wounds. By night, she became something else entirely. She infiltrated forums where whistleblowers and investigative journalists lingered, trading pieces of information until she found allies she could trust. Slowly, she began leaking Mercadia's darkest secrets under the pseudonym Veritas. Each release exposed a new layer of corruption, falsified contracts, collusion with politicians, backroom deals that funneled taxpayer money into the company's accounts. The stories caught fire. Independent news outlets picked them up first, then larger publications were forced to follow. Mercadia issued furious denials, branding the leaks as fabrications, but Claire knew the documents were too detailed, too damning to dismiss. Lawsuits began to pile up as the victims of Mercadia's schemes recognized their own losses in the stories being printed. The stock price wavered. Executives scrambled to assure investors that everything was under control. Still, Claire knew it wouldn't be enough. Corporations like Mercadia survived scandals the way sharks survived storms, by simply continuing to move forward, devouring whatever was in their path. If she truly wanted justice, she needed to strike at their core. That meant following the money, not just the lies. She worked tirelessly, cross-referencing offshore accounts, tracing the movement of funds through dummy corporations and back into the hands of Mercadia's board members. It was like untangling a spider's web, but with every connection she uncovered, the shape of the trap became clearer. When she finally compiled the evidence into a single, damning dossier, she sent it not only to the press but to federal investigators and rival firms who had long waited for a chance to see Mercadia bleed. The retaliation came swiftly. Claire was followed by unmarked cars, her emails hacked, her apartment broken into. Once, she returned home to find her belongings ransacked and a single piece of paper on her kitchen table. "Stop now, or next time it's not just your things we'll touch." Fear threatened to swallow her whole, but by then she was too deep to turn back. She moved into safe houses, relied on cash instead of cards, and lived like a fugitive while watching the corporation that had once owned her life begin to collapse. The climax came with the arrest of Mercadia's CEO, a man whose calm arrogance had once seemed untouchable. Cameras swarmed the courthouse steps as he was led away in handcuffs, his empire unraveling behind him. Billions in fraud were exposed, assets frozen, lawsuits filed that would drag on for decades. For the families who had lost everything, it wasn't enough to restore what had been taken, but it was a reckoning they had never expected to see. Claire watched the coverage from a dimly lit motel room, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. She didn't step forward to claim credit. To the world, she remained only Veritas, a faceless name on leaked documents. But she knew what she had done, and more importantly, she knew that Mercadia would never rise again. In the quiet that followed, Claire returned to her father's shop, now safe from the claws of the corporation. The city still glittered with the towers of other companies, other predators, and she understood that the war against greed would never truly end. But for her, vengeance was complete. She had taken on a giant and carved it down to its knees. And though the world would never know her name, she carried the satisfaction of a woman who had fought back and won. Claire thought it would end with the CEO's arrest, with the collapse of Mercadia Holdings under the weight of its own greed. But victory was never so clean. Even as headlines blared about corruption and fraud, the company's remaining directors began whispering about restructuring, about salvaging what was left. Men in expensive suits, who had signed off on ruinous deals, were quietly moving their money into new ventures. For them, one empire falling was just an opportunity to build another, and Claire realized her fight wasn't finished. The system she had believed in, the regulators, the courts, the very institutions designed to protect the powerless, moved too slowly, deliberately so. She saw executives making bail, walking free with smug smiles, already preparing their defenses. The lawyers they hired twisted facts into half-truths, while public relations firms spun narratives of misunderstood strategies and temporary setbacks. It enraged her. They had destroyed lives, stolen livelihoods, driven people into bankruptcy, and now they were slipping through the cracks of justice. That anger sharpened Claire's resolve. She began digging deeper, this time not just into the company, but into the individuals who had run it. She followed the trail of their personal wealth, tracing hidden real estate purchases, offshore trusts, and luxury assets bought under fake names. She exposed not only their professional crimes, but their private hypocrisies. One board member who had publicly preached fiscal responsibility was revealed to own a secret collection of mansions in 3 countries, funded by stolen pensions. Another, who had claimed ignorance of Mercadia's dealings, was unmasked as the controlling hand behind a shadow corporation that had laundered millions. She fed these revelations directly to the public, bypassing cautious journalists. Anonymous posts, data dumps, timed leaks, each one landed like a hammer on the fragile reputations of the powerful. Families turned against their disgraced patriarchs, children of executives found themselves ostracized in universities, and spouses filed for divorce under the weight of scandal. Claire wasn't just dismantling a company anymore. She was burning the lives of its architects to ash. The more she struck, the more the world rallied behind her unseen hand. Victims of Mercadia found one another, forming groups to sue, to protest, to demand action. Ordinary citizens began treating her as a folk hero, a ghostly avenger who spoke for those who had been silenced. The name, Veritas, was whispered in financial districts with equal parts admiration and fear. Executives in other firms tightened their books, scrubbing accounts and transactions, terrified they might be next. But vengeance has a cost, and Claire began to feel it pressing down on her. She lived with shadows at her back, never staying in one place for too long, never using her real name. Friends she had once trusted drifted away, frightened by the danger that followed her. Her reflection in the mirror grew harder, sharper. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The Claire who had once dreamed of making a difference was gone. In her place stood someone colder, someone who measured victories not in ideals, but in the number of enemies brought to ruin. The climax of her crusade came when she released one final, devastating leak, a complete archive of Mercadia's darkest transactions, spanning years, implicating not only its executives but the politicians, judges, and bankers who had enabled them. It was a detonation that no one could contain. Governments scrambled to investigate. Elections were thrown into chaos as candidates were exposed for taking Mercadia's bribes. Courtrooms filled with defendants in tailored suits, all denying, all crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Claire didn't watch the chaos from the sidelines this time. She disappeared completely, leaving behind no trace of her identity, only the name Veritas carved into the history of financial justice. Some said she had fled abroad, living quietly under a new life. Others whispered that she had died, silenced by those who still had power to protect. The truth was that Claire had simply walked away, tired, emptied, her vengeance complete. But the world she left behind was scarred. Mercadia was gone, its leaders ruined, its name a cautionary tale. People spoke of the reckoning as if it were a myth, a story to scare the powerful into remembering that no crime could remain hidden forever. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the city, a woman who had once lost everything found a strange peace in knowing that she had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been crushed beneath the weight of greed. Her fight was over, but her shadow lingered, a warning etched into every boardroom, every contract, every decision made in pursuit of profit. And though no one knew her name, they all remembered the fear that one woman, armed only with truth, anger, and relentless determination, could bring down an empire. Claire had always been stubborn. It was a trait her mother used to say would either save her or destroy her, and as she sat in the dim light of her father's shop long after closing, staring at ledgers and court filings spread across the counter, she wondered which it would be. The fight had consumed her life. Yet she felt no urge to stop, not when she thought about the families who had lost everything, not when she remembered her father's shaking hands holding the foreclosure notice that had nearly stolen his livelihood. Mercadia had turned numbers into weapons, and Claire had sworn she would use those same numbers to bring them down. Even after the arrests, after the headlines declared the company finished, Claire knew better. Corporations like Mercadia never really died. They shed their names like snakes shedding skin, reforming under new banners, recycling the same men in new suits. Already she had seen filings for emerging subsidiaries, vague shell companies with familiar fingerprints hidden in their paperwork. The arrogance was infuriating. They believed themselves untouchable, immune to the destruction they had caused. That arrogance became her next target. She spent weeks digging into those shells, tracing them to addresses that didn't exist, to offshore accounts registered under laughably thin disguises. Claire wasn't just exposing fraud anymore. She was hunting. Every discovery gave her a surge of grim satisfaction. Every time she cracked open another hidden structure, she imagined the panic in boardrooms as they realized someone out there was always 2 steps ahead of them. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. One night, as she returned to a small apartment she had been renting under an alias, she noticed the front door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was missing, but the message was clear. A photograph lay on the kitchen table, a grainy image of her father leaving the shop. Scrawled across it in red marker were 3 words: "Time is running." The fear cut through her like ice. For a moment, she considered walking away, burning everything, erasing Veritas, trying to reclaim a life that wasn't lived in shadows. But fear only hardened her resolve. If they were watching her, it meant she had struck deep enough to hurt them. If they wanted her silenced, it meant she was closer than ever. She changed her methods. No more working alone. Claire reached out to contacts she had only trusted at arm's length before, disillusioned insiders, whistleblowers in waiting, even hackers who thrived on chaos. Together, they formed an invisible network, feeding her information, verifying data, amplifying her leaks. She became less a single woman and more a movement, the faceless embodiment of every victim who had ever been crushed by greed. Her enemies tried to adapt. They paid off journalists to plant stories questioning Veritas's credibility. They flooded the internet with fabricated leaks to muddy the truth. They filed injunctions, manipulated algorithms, even hired digital mercenaries to track her down. But Claire had learned to live like a ghost. Every time they thought they had cornered her, she was already gone, leaving behind another devastating revelation. And with each revelation, she grew bolder. She no longer confined herself to balance sheets and contracts. She began targeting reputations. Executives who had destroyed small businesses now found their own secrets dragged into the light. Affairs, bribes, abusive behavior buried under non-disclosure agreements. Politicians who had defended Mercadia on television were exposed for taking its money. Judges who had dismissed cases against the corporation were unmasked as owning shares in its subsidiaries. She was no longer just dismantling a corporation. She was dismantling a system. The world noticed. Protests erupted outside financial districts, fueled by her leaks. Governments, once content to look away, were forced into action as public fury boiled over. Claire watched it unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had started as one woman fighting for her father, but now she had become something far larger than herself. Yet the victory was not without cost. Every day, she felt the walls closing in tighter. Friends from her past life had stopped answering her calls, afraid of being dragged into her storm. Her father, though safe from Mercadia's grasp, looked at her with quiet worry, as if he could sense the toll it was taking. She caught herself staring into mirrors, seeing the lines of wear, the shadows under her eyes, the hardness in her expression. She had become a weapon, but weapons were not meant to rest. The final blow came when she leaked a trove of files tying Mercadia's collapse directly to members of the government. The fallout was seismic. Resignations rippled through parliaments. Elections were overturned. Laws were rewritten to close the loopholes she had exposed. For weeks, the world seemed to burn under the fire she had set. And when the flames finally dimmed, Claire realized she had done what she set out to do. She had not just avenged her family or the victims of Mercadia. She had carved her vengeance into the financial world itself. She vanished after that. Some said she disappeared overseas, living quietly under a false name, her war finally over. Others believed the corporations had caught up with her, silenced her before she could go further. But those who had followed her crusade knew the truth. Veritas was never just one woman anymore. It was an idea, a reminder that even the most powerful empires could bleed when a single determined soul refused to bow. And somewhere, far from the noise of collapsing boardrooms and panicked governments, Claire Duval allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in years. Not anger, not exhaustion, but peace. She had fought, she had won, and the world would never forget the vengeance of one woman against a corporation that thought itself untouchable.